There are nights when the soul grows quiet in a way that no one else can see. The room may be still, the lamp may be low, the body may be tired, and yet deep inside there is a place that still whispers, "Why am I here? Why did God leave me in this world when so much has already been taken from me?" And tonight, gently, slowly, without pressure, without hurry, we walk with a woman who knew that question. Her name was Naomi. Her name once meant pleasant, sweet, full of grace, full of beauty, full of the warmth of home. But before her story became a story of restoration, it became a story of loss. Before her arms held new life, her hands were emptied. Before her name was remembered with honor, she walked through a valley where she believed God had dealt bitterly with her. So breathe softly now. Let your shoulders lower. Let your hands loosen. Let your heart come as it is. You do not have to pretend tonight. You do not have to be strong tonight. You do not have to hide the ache that has followed you through the years. The Lord who saw Naomi sees you also. The Lord who knew the silence of Bethlehem knows the silence of your room. And the Lord who was quietly working in the emptiness of an elderly widow is still able to work in the quiet places of your life. Long ago, in the days when judges ruled over Israel, Bethlehem was meant to be a place of bread. Even the name Bethlehem carried that promise, the house of bread, a place where families would gather around tables, where grain would be ground, where children would sleep with full bellies, where old men and old women would sit near doorways and watch the evening settle over familiar stones. But there came a famine in the land. The fields that should have moved like gold beneath the sun grew thin and uncertain. The soil that had once given food began to hold back. The air became dry with worry. Mothers measured flour with trembling hands. Fathers looked toward empty hills and said very little. The streets grew quieter, not with peace, but with the kind of silence that comes when people are afraid to speak their fear aloud. And in that slow hunger, Naomi lived with her husband, Elimelech, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. She had known the rhythms of home. She had known the sound of her family breathing under one roof. She had known the ordinary blessings that seem small until they begin to disappear. A meal, a doorway, a familiar road, a husband's voice, a child's footsteps, the nearness of people who belong to you. These are holy things, though we often recognize their holiness only after grief has touched them. Elimelech looked at Bethlehem and saw danger for his family. He saw hunger stretching ahead like a road with no shade. So he made a decision that many desperate people have made across the ages. He decided to leave, not forever perhaps, not with joy, not with certainty, but with the heavy hope that somewhere else, across the distance, there might be enough to survive. Moab lay beyond the land of promise, beyond what was familiar, beyond the stories and songs Naomi had carried in her bones since childhood. To leave Bethlehem for Moab was not just to move from one place to another. It was to step away from known ground into a land that felt strange to the heart. Naomi may have looked at the doorway of her home one last time. She may have touched the wall, the wooden frame, the place where daily life had gathered itself for years. She may have listened to the quiet rooms and wondered whether she would ever hear them filled again. And maybe, as the family prepared to go, she told herself what many grieving people tell themselves in the beginning. This is only for a season. This is only until things get better. We will come back when the famine passes. We will come back when the fields live again. We will come back when God remembers Bethlehem with bread. The road to Moab would not have felt gentle. It would have carried the weight of everything they could not bring. and everything they were afraid to lose. Naomi walked as a wife and mother, but also as a woman leaving behind the familiar shape of her life. The dust rose around their feet. The sun moved slowly over them. The nights likely felt wider in the open places, the darkness filled with sounds that did not belong to home. Perhaps her sons asked questions along the way. Perhaps Elimelech answered with forced confidence, trying to sound certain for the sake of those he loved. And perhaps Naomi listened, holding her thoughts in the quiet chamber of her heart. When life changes suddenly, the body keeps moving because it must, but the soul often lags behind. The soul keeps turning back toward the place it knew. The soul keeps asking whether leaving was faith or fear, wisdom or surrender, survival or loss. And yet even there, God was not absent. Even on the road away from Bethlehem, the Lord saw every footstep. He saw the family crossing into uncertainty. He saw Naomi's tired hands. He saw the first threads of a story Naomi herself could not yet understand. But hidden work is still work. Silent mercy is still mercy. And the fact that heaven is quiet does not mean heaven has turned away. For anyone listening tonight who has had to leave something behind, the story begins here, in that tender ache of departure. Maybe you did not leave a town, but you left a season of strength. Maybe you left the home where your children were small. Maybe you left a marriage because death took the one who knew your name in a way no one else ever will. Maybe you left independence. Maybe you left health. Maybe you left the easy confidence that tomorrow would resemble yesterday. And now, like Naomi, you have crossed into a land that feels unfamiliar. You may still live in the same house, and yet life itself feels like Moab, strange, foreign, difficult to understand. But listen softly. Naomi's story does not begin with her understanding God's plan. It begins with hunger. It begins with movement. It begins with an older woman being carried by circumstances she never would have chosen. And that means your story, even in its confusion, can still be held by God. You do not have to know what the Lord is doing in order for the Lord to be doing something. You do not have to feel hopeful for hope to be near. You do not have to see the harvest while you are still walking through famine. When Naomi reached Moab, life did not become simple. Survival is not the same as peace. There may have been food there. Yes, enough to keep going, enough to wake another day, enough to build some kind of life in a place that was not home. But the heart has its own hunger. The heart hungers for belonging, for familiarity, for the sound of prayer spoken among one's own people, for the comfort of being understood without explaining every sorrow. Naomi lived as a stranger. She had to learn the shape of Moabite days, the customs of Moabite neighbors, the sound of a language and culture that did not cradle her childhood memories. She may have watched women in that land going about their work and felt both near and far from them. Grief often begins before anyone dies. Sometimes grief begins when life becomes unrecognizable. Sometimes it begins when a woman sits in a foreign place and realizes she has survived, but she no longer feels at home in the world. And yet, even there, ordinary duties continued. Bread had to be prepared, water had to be gathered, clothing had to be mended, sons had to be loved, a husband had to be supported. The soul may have been aching, but the hands still worked, as they often do for those who are older, those who have carried families, those who know how to keep going even when the heart is heavy. Then came the first great blow. Elimelech died, the man who had led the family out of Bethlehem, the man who had made the decision to seek life in Moab, the man whose presence gave Naomi some sense of covering in a foreign land, was gone. Scripture speaks of it simply. But there is a whole ocean inside that sentence. Her husband died. The voice beside her was gone. The shared memory was gone. The one who knew what Bethlehem had been like before the famine was gone. The one who could remember with her, regret with her, hope with her, and carry the burden of their choices with her was gone. And Naomi was left with her 2 sons. In the ancient world, widowhood was not only emotional sorrow, it was vulnerability, it was uncertainty, it was a narrowing of protection, a trembling of future, a deep question about provision and place. But Naomi still had Mahlon and Chilion. She still had 2 living branches from the tree of her marriage. She still had voices in the house. She still had sons to look upon and perhaps say, "The Lord has not taken everything. There is still life here. There is still a reason to wake. There is still something of Elimelech in their faces." The years in Moab continued, and Naomi's sons took wives from the women of Moab. One was named Orpah, and the other was named Ruth. These young women entered Naomi's life not as strangers only, but as daughters by marriage, as companions within the fragile house that grief had already touched. Perhaps Naomi taught them some of the ways of Israel. Perhaps they learned the sound of her prayers, the names of the Lord, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the memory of a land called Bethlehem, where barley once rose from the earth in golden waves. Perhaps they watched her move through sorrow with quiet endurance. Often the elderly teach without knowing they are teaching. A younger woman watches how an older woman folds cloth, how she blesses food, how she grieves without becoming cruel, how she speaks of God even when her voice is tired. Ruth and Orpah may have learned more from Naomi's wounded faith than from any perfect sermon. For 10 years life went on in this mingled household of memory and adaptation. 10 years is long enough to build routines, long enough to begin accepting the land you never planned to live in, long enough to bury one dream and form another, long enough to think, perhaps this is what remains, and perhaps I can live with it. But then the second blow came, and it came with a darkness that must have felt almost unbearable. Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. Naomi's sons, the last living pieces of the family she had carried from Bethlehem, were taken. Again, scripture is brief, but the grief is immeasurable. The house that once held a husband and 2 sons now held 3 widows. Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth were left together, each carrying a different sorrow, each facing a future with no husband's hand beside her. But Naomi's sorrow had a particular depth. She had buried not only her husband, but her children. She had seen the line of her family, as far as she could tell, cut down before her eyes. The names that should have continued, the grandchildren she may have imagined, the laughter she may have hoped would return to her old age, all seemed to vanish into silence. There are losses that do not merely hurt the heart, they rearrange the entire meaning of one's life. Naomi may have looked around and wondered what remained of her. Wife was gone. Mother, in the way she had known it, was gone. Home was far away. Security was gone. The future had become a blank road with no clear destination. This is the place where many elderly hearts quietly live, even while the world continues around them. People may see the body sitting in a chair, walking slowly through a hallway, looking out a window, folding hands in prayer, but they do not always see the invisible names being carried inside. The husband, the wife, the child, the sibling, the friend, the house that was sold, the strength that faded, the role that disappeared, the years that cannot be returned. Naomi's grief was not abstract. It had names: Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion, and perhaps your grief has names too, names you speak often, or names you can barely speak without tears. Tonight, this story does not rush you away from that grief. God's word does not ask Naomi to smile quickly. It does not scold her for feeling empty. It lets her stand in the truth of what happened, and that is part of healing, to be seen truthfully, to be allowed to say, "This hurt me, this changed me, this left me feeling alone." The Lord is not frightened by honest sorrow. He does not turn away from tears that have been held back too long. He is near to the broken-hearted, even when the broken-hearted cannot yet feel his nearness. Then, somewhere inside the heaviness of Moab, a word reached Naomi. It came quietly, perhaps through travelers, perhaps through the kind of conversation that moves from one person to another, across roads and markets and thresholds. The Lord had visited his people and given them bread. Bethlehem was no longer locked in famine. The fields had begun to speak again. The house of bread had bread again. It is a simple report, and yet for Naomi it must have stirred something deep and painful. News of blessing can hurt when it reaches a grieving heart. To hear that home is alive again, while your own house feels dead, can open wounds. The God who had visited Bethlehem, had he forgotten Naomi in Moab? The people back home were eating again, but Naomi's table was still marked by absence. Still the news moved her. Sometimes hope does not arrive as joy. Sometimes hope arrives as the strength to take one step. Sometimes hope is not a song, but a decision. Naomi arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard that the Lord had visited his people. She did not return full. She did not return triumphant. She did not return with answers. She returned because somewhere beneath the ashes of sorrow there was still a road back. So Naomi prepared to leave Moab. Think of that moment slowly. An older widow gathering what little remained, not packing abundance but remnants, not surrounded by sons lifting burdens, but by two young widows whose own futures were uncertain. The road that once brought Naomi away from Bethlehem would now have to carry her back, but she was not the same woman who had left. When she first crossed toward Moab, she had a husband, she had sons, she had the anxious hope of survival. Now she had graves behind her. She had memories that would not stop speaking. She had questions about God that had become heavier than the bundle in her hands. Every familiar object may have carried pain. Every step away from Moab may have felt like another farewell, not because Moab had become beloved in the way Bethlehem was beloved, but because Moab held the bodies of those she had lost. Grief can make even a painful place sacred. A land of exile can become the land where your beloved is buried. To leave it can feel like losing them again. Naomi was walking away from the graves of her husband and sons and toward a home that might no longer recognize her. And as she set out, Ruth and Orpah went with her. 3 widows on a road, 3 women marked by loss, 3 futures trembling in the open air. Naomi may have heard their footsteps beside her and felt both comfort and concern. She loved them, but love in grief can become complicated. She did not want her sorrow to become their prison. She did not want her emptiness to swallow their youth. Somewhere along the road, Naomi turned to them and told them to go back, each to her mother's house. She blessed them with tenderness. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Those words reveal something beautiful about Naomi, even in pain. She was bitter, but she was not loveless. She was wounded, but she could still bless. She was emptied, but she could still recognize kindness. That matters deeply. Sometimes older people think that because they are grieving, they have nothing left to give. But even before Naomi became a guide again, even before redemption unfolded, she still had a blessing in her mouth. She still had the power to speak kindness over younger lives. She still had spiritual weight, even when she felt broken. Naomi's blessing also tells us that Ruth and Orpah had loved her well. They had dealt kindly with the dead and with Naomi. They had stayed through funerals. They had remained near the older widow when life might have been easier somewhere else. And Naomi, perhaps with tears, urged them to seek rest in new homes. She kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. This was not a cold separation. This was love standing at the edge of impossibility. The road to Bethlehem was not simple for Moabite widows. Naomi had no sons to offer them, no security to promise, no visible future to share. She could not imagine how their lives would be restored by staying with her. In her mind, she was too old to begin again, too empty to help them, too marked by sorrow to be a place of hope. She said that the hand of the Lord had gone out against her, and in that sentence, we hear the theology of a broken heart. Naomi still believed in God, but she interpreted her life through loss. She could not yet see mercy. She could only see the graves. She could not yet see harvest. She could only see emptiness. And the Lord, in His patience, allowed her to speak from where she was. Beloved listener, there may have been times when you too looked at your life and interpreted everything through what was taken. You may have counted the losses until they became the only numbers that seemed real. You may have said, I am too old now. I am too tired now. I have nothing to offer now. The best years are behind me. The people who needed me are gone. The world has moved on without me. But Naomi's story asks us to wait gently before believing that grief has the final interpretation. Naomi thought she was only returning empty. She did not know she was carrying Ruth toward Boaz. She did not know she was walking toward Obed. She did not know she was moving toward David's line, and far beyond David, toward the mercy of Christ. She saw herself as a burden, but God was making her a bridge. She saw herself as finished, but God was placing her in the middle of redemption. And tonight, before sleep comes, let this truth rest softly upon you. You may not know what your remaining breath is for. Naomi did not know either, but God knew, and that was enough. As the first part of Naomi's journey closes, we leave her on the road between what had buried her and what would restore her. She is not healed yet. She is not rejoicing yet. She is not holding the child yet. She has not yet seen the field of Boaz, or the kindness waiting among the barley, or the city gate where redemption would be spoken publicly. She is simply walking, and sometimes walking is faith, not bright faith, not loud faith, not faith with songs and certainty, but faith that rises from a bed of sorrow and takes one more step toward the place where God has given bread. If all you can do tonight is breathe, that breath can be prayer. If all you can do is turn your heart slightly toward God, that turning can be grace. If all you can do is admit that you feel empty, even that honesty can become the place where mercy begins. Naomi's night was deep, but it was not endless. Her losses were real, but they were not the whole story. The road was long, but it was leading somewhere. And as your body grows heavier and the room grows softer, remember this, slowly, gently, tenderly. The God of Bethlehem was already moving before Naomi understood. The God of Naomi is still moving in hidden ways, and even in the night, even in age, even in grief, even after so much has changed, your story is still held in His hands. The road from Moab toward Bethlehem stretched beneath the feet of 3 widows, and the land around them seemed to hold its breath. Behind them lay graves, memories, rooms emptied by death, and years Naomi could not gather back into her arms. Before them lay a country Naomi had once called home, though home itself can become frightening when you are returning without the people who made it feel safe. The path was not smooth. It moved through rough earth, over dry ridges, past stones warmed by the sun, past low shrubs bending in the wind, past wide places where the sky seemed almost too large for a grieving heart to bear. Naomi walked slowly, not because the distance alone was heavy, but because sorrow makes every step feel as though the body is carrying more than flesh. Ruth and Orpah walked with her, two young women whose sandals pressed the same dust, whose faces were touched by the same light, whose hearts were also wounded by names they would never call again. The wind moved gently across their garments. The earth smelled of dust and dry grass. Far away, hills faded into a pale horizon, and the journey seemed both outward and inward, a road across land and a road through the deepest places of loss. Naomi may have heard the small sounds of Ruth and Orpah behind her, the shifting of cloth, the soft rhythm of breathing, the quiet endurance of women who had already wept until no tears came easily. And perhaps that sound pierced her. Perhaps love itself became painful, because she looked at these young widows and could not imagine giving them anything except poverty, uncertainty, and a share in her bitterness. So Naomi stopped along the road, turning toward Ruth and Orpah with the tenderness of someone who loves deeply enough to let go. The sun may have been lowering, laying long amber shadows across the path. The stones beneath their feet may have glowed faintly in that tired light. Naomi looked at the two women who had become daughters to her through marriage and grief, and she told them to return, each to her mother's house, not angrily, not coldly, but with the weary mercy of a woman who believed her own road had become too hard for anyone else to follow. She blessed them there in the open air, far from the security of walls, far from the comfort of a family table. She asked the Lord to deal kindly with them, as they had dealt kindly with the dead and with her. Those words came from a heart that was wounded, yet still able to recognize goodness. Naomi's faith was bruised, but it was not dead. Her grief was deep, but it had not made her blind to kindness. She could still bless. She could still speak the name of the Lord over someone else's future, even while she felt uncertain about her own. And this is one of the quiet miracles of aging faith. A person may feel empty, may feel useless, may feel that life has taken too much, and yet from that very person can still come a blessing that changes the road for another soul. Naomi did not think she was giving anything great in that moment. She did not know how heaven was listening. She did not know that her words, spoken through grief, were part of the sacred doorway through which Ruth would enter the story of redemption. Ruth and Orpah lifted their voices and wept. The sound of their crying rose into the wide, open country like a human answer to all that had been lost. They clung to Naomi, and for a moment the road was not a road at all, but a place of farewell, a place where love and grief held each other tightly. They told her they would return with her to her people. And perhaps Naomi's heart trembled at their loyalty. Perhaps part of her wanted to say, yes, stay near me, walk with me. Do not leave me alone with all this silence. But another part of her, the part shaped by age and harsh reality, knew the world as it often is for widows without sons, without wealth, without protection. She could not offer them husbands. She could not offer them children. She could not offer them a future that looked safe. Naomi spoke again, and her words came heavy with resignation. She asked whether there were still sons in her womb, whether she could bear husbands for them, whether they should wait for a possibility that would never come. She was telling them, as gently as she could, that she believed her life had closed. She believed her own hope was too old to help anyone else. She believed the hand of the Lord had gone out against her. The sentence was painful but honest, and in that honesty there is room for every weary listener tonight, who has ever looked at the story of their own life and whispered, "God has dealt hard with me." The scripture does not hide Naomi's bitterness. It lets us hear it, and because we hear it, we know that God can hold a heart that is not yet healed. Orpah kissed Naomi and turned back, and we should not speak of her with cruelty. Her farewell was sorrowful. Her tears were real. She had loved Naomi. She had walked part of the road. She had stayed through loss. But at the edge of the impossible, she returned to what she knew. The land of Moab received her again, and her footsteps faded behind them. Then the road grew quieter. Naomi turned toward Ruth, perhaps with a deeper ache now, perhaps with the final loneliness pressing closer. She told Ruth to follow her sister-in-law back to her people and to her gods. But Ruth did not move away. Ruth stayed, and in the stillness between the two women, something holy began to unfold. The air itself seemed to pause around Ruth's decision. The sky above them, the dust beneath them, the long road ahead, all became witnesses to a covenant of love spoken not in a temple, not at an altar, not before priests, but on a lonely road between two broken lives. Ruth said words that have echoed through centuries because they rose from loyal love. She would not leave Naomi. Where Naomi went, Ruth would go. Where Naomi lodged, Ruth would lodge. Naomi's people would be Ruth's people, and Naomi's God would be Ruth's God. Where Naomi died, Ruth would die, and there she would be buried. It was not merely affection. It was surrender. It was faith beginning to bloom in foreign soil. It was a young widow binding her future to an older widow who believed she had no future left. Naomi looked at Ruth and saw that she was determined. There was nothing more to say. So the two of them walked on together, no longer three widows but two, bound by a loyalty Naomi had not expected and perhaps did not yet know how to receive. The road toward Bethlehem still stretched long before them. The hills rose and fell beneath the changing light. In the morning, the land may have shone pale and cool, with mist lying in the low places. At noon, the sun may have pressed upon their backs, bright and unrelenting. In the evening, the world may have turned bronze and violet, with distant birds moving like small shadows across the sky. Ruth walked beside Naomi into a future she did not understand. Naomi walked beside Ruth, carrying sorrow so deep she could not yet recognize Ruth as a gift from God. And this is often how mercy comes to us, not as a sudden answer that explains everything, not as a voice from heaven that removes every fear, but as someone who stays, a hand beside us, a presence on the road. A faithful love that keeps walking when grief has convinced us we are alone. Naomi may have thought she was returning empty, but Ruth was walking next to her. Naomi may have thought the Lord had taken everything, but the Lord had placed covenant love at her side. Sometimes the first sign of restoration is so quiet that we mistake it for ordinary companionship. Sometimes God's answer to our deepest loneliness is not a change in circumstance, but a faithful soul who refuses to abandon us on the road. As Bethlehem came into view, the town must have risen slowly from the folds of the land, its stone houses resting along the hills of Judah, its paths winding between homes, its fields spreading beyond the edges like the beginning of a promise. Perhaps the barley stood in soft movement beneath the breeze, green gold and trembling in the light. Perhaps the air carried the scent of earth, grain, animals, cooking fires, and the faint sweetness of harvest. For Naomi, every familiar outline may have cut the heart. The hills remembered her younger feet. The roads remembered her family leaving. The stones remembered a woman who had gone away with husband and sons, and now returned with only Ruth beside her. Bethlehem was alive again, but Naomi felt inwardly deadened by grief. The town stirred when she arrived. Women looked closely. Faces changed with recognition and surprise. Is this Naomi? The question moved through the town like wind through dry leaves. Is this the woman who left years ago? Is this the wife of Elimelech? Is this the mother of Mahlon and Chilion? Time and sorrow had written upon her face. Her body may have bent more than before. Her eyes may have carried the faraway look of one who has seen too many graves. The town remembered her name, but Naomi did not feel like the woman that name once described. She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, call me bitter, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." Those words stood in the air of Bethlehem, with the ache of a soul finally saying aloud what it has carried for years. She did not soften it. She did not decorate it. She did not protect the people around her from the truth of her pain. She believed she had gone out full because she had left with her husband and sons. She believed she had returned empty because those beloved faces were gone. And yet, even in that statement, there is a holy mystery. Ruth was standing beside her. Ruth, whose loyalty would become a doorway of redemption. Ruth, whose future child would one day be placed in Naomi's arms. Ruth, whose life would become woven into the lineage of David, and through David, into the earthly ancestry of Christ. But Naomi could not see that yet. She could only name the absence. She could only feel the emptiness. She could only interpret the moment through the losses behind her. And this is why the story is so gentle with us. It understands that grief can stand beside blessing and still be unable to see it. It understands that a person can be surrounded by hidden mercy and still feel abandoned. It understands that healing is often slower than arrival. Naomi had returned to Bethlehem, but her heart had not yet come home. The town may have settled again after the first shock of her return, but Naomi's words would have lingered. "Call me Mara, bitter." The name itself tasted like tears, yet there was something deeply sacred about her honesty. She brought her bitterness into the place of bread. She did not wait until she felt grateful. She did not wait until her theology was neat. She did not wait until her voice sounded strong. She came home wounded. And beloved listener, there is permission here. You can come to God before you feel peaceful. You can come to prayer before you feel certain. You can come carrying questions, disappointment, exhaustion, and the heaviness of years. Naomi did not yet praise. Naomi lamented. And lament is not unbelief. Lament is faith speaking through tears. Lament means the heart still turns toward God, even if the words are broken. When Naomi said the Almighty had dealt bitterly with her, she was still speaking of God. She was still bringing her life into His presence, even if she could only bring accusation and sorrow. And the Lord did not strike her down for honesty. He did not erase her from the story. He did not choose a less wounded woman. He continued to work quietly, patiently, beneath the surface of her pain. And all the while, Bethlehem was entering harvest. This detail rests in the story like a small lamp in a dark room. Naomi and Ruth came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. The famine that had once driven Naomi away had ended. The fields were awake. The land was yielding again. Men were cutting grain. Women were gathering. The sun rose over terraces and fields where stalks bent beneath fullness. The wind moved over barley heads in soft waves, and the sound may have been like whispers of provision. Grain fell into baskets. Dust shimmered in beams of light. The smell of cut stalks and warm earth drifted through the air. Yet Naomi, inside her grief, may not have felt the meaning of the season. Harvest outside does not always feel like harvest within. A grieving person can stand in a field of abundance and still feel poor. An elderly widow can hear the town rejoice over bread and still feel there is no bread for the hunger of her heart. But God often begins with what seems external. A field, a season, a law of gleaning, a relative whose name has not yet been fully understood. A young woman willing to work, a small opening where survival can begin. Before Naomi felt restored, the conditions of restoration were already gathering around her. Ruth the Moabite stood in Bethlehem as a stranger. She had chosen Naomi's people, but the people did not yet fully know her. She had chosen Naomi's God, but she was still poor, widowed, foreign, and vulnerable. The ancient streets of Bethlehem may have watched her with curiosity. The women may have whispered about the Moabite daughter-in-law who would not leave Naomi. The men in the fields may have noticed her unfamiliar face. And Ruth, with quiet courage, looked at the practical need before them. They needed food. Naomi had returned with grief, but grief still needs bread. Tears do not remove hunger from the body. Faith does not cancel the need for daily provision. So Ruth asked Naomi to let her go into the fields and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight she might find favor. There is such humility in this request. Ruth was not asking for comfort or recognition. She was asking for the chance to bend low and gather what was left behind. In Israel's law, God had made room for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner by commanding landowners not to strip their fields bare. The edges and fallen grain were to become mercy. Even in the law of harvest, God had hidden compassion for people like Naomi and Ruth. Naomi said to Ruth, "Go, my daughter." The words were simple, but they carried trust, exhaustion, and perhaps the faintest movement of hope. Ruth went out into the morning, and the fields of Bethlehem opened before her. Imagine the light spreading slowly over the land, touching the stone walls first, then the rooftops, then the slopes where barley trembled in the dawn. Workers entered the fields with practiced rhythm. Sickles flashed softly. Bundles were tied. Voices called across rows. The air carried the dry whisper of stalks brushing against garments, the low murmur of labor, the occasional laughter of harvesters, the footsteps of servants moving between cut grain. Ruth stepped into this world as one who had no claim except need and no protection except whatever favor God might provide. She bent down and gathered. One stalk, then another, then another. Her hands moved carefully over the ground. Dust clung to her fingers. The sun warmed her back. The day lengthened. Gleaning was humble work, slow work, tiring work, work done close to the earth. And yet in that low place, God was guiding her. The story says she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. She happened. Such a small word for such a great providence. What looked accidental on earth was being arranged in heaven. Boaz came from Bethlehem and greeted the reapers with a blessing. "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." In that exchange, the field itself seemed to become a place of reverence. Work and worship touched. Grain and grace stood together beneath the same sky. Boaz was a man of standing, a man of worth, a relative of Elimelech. Though Ruth did not yet understand the full importance of this. He looked over the field and noticed Ruth, noticed the foreign widow bending low among the gleaners, noticed the woman whose presence might have been ignored by someone less attentive. He asked the servant in charge of the reapers whose young woman she was. The servant told him about Ruth, the Moabite who had returned with Naomi from Moab, the woman who had asked to glean and had worked steadily from morning until now, resting only a little. Her hidden faithfulness was being spoken aloud. Ruth did not announce herself with greatness. She simply stayed loyal, traveled the road, and bent to gather grain. But God saw, and then Boaz saw. There is comfort in this for every quiet soul who feels unnoticed. The labor of love, the caregiving, the prayers, the endurance, the small daily acts of faithfulness that no one applauds, all of it is visible to God. And at the right time, God can cause the right person to notice what has been hidden. Boaz spoke to Ruth with kindness. He told her not to go glean in another field and not to leave this one. He told her to stay close to his young women. He told her he had commanded the young men not to touch her. He told her that when she was thirsty, she could drink from what the young men had drawn. In a world where Ruth was poor, foreign, widowed, and exposed, these words were shelter. They were not merely polite, they were protection. They created a safe space around a vulnerable woman. Ruth fell on her face, bowing to the ground, overwhelmed by favor she did not expect. She asked why she had found grace in his eyes, since she was a foreigner, and Boaz answered with words that must have entered her heart like cool water. He had heard of all she had done for Naomi after the death of her husband. He had heard how she left father, mother, and native land to come to a people she did not know before. Then he blessed her in the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings she had come to take refuge, under whose wings. Such tender words. Ruth, who had left one land and entered another, was not merely under the kindness of Boaz. She was under the wings of God. The field became more than a field. It became the first visible mercy in Naomi's long night. At mealtime, Boaz invited Ruth to come near. He offered bread dipped in wine. He gave her roasted grain until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. The woman who had come to gather scraps found herself seated among workers, eating enough, receiving more than survival. Then, when she returned to glean, Boaz quietly instructed his young men to let her gather even among the sheaves, and not to reproach her. He told them to pull out some from the bundles and leave it for her to glean. Mercy became deliberate but gentle. Generosity hid itself in the rhythm of work so Ruth could receive without shame. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows shifted. The barley fell. Ruth gathered until evening, then beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley, a remarkable amount for one day's labor. Her arms must have ached as she carried it back to town. Her garments may have been dusted with chaff. Her face may have been tired, but her heart may have carried a quiet astonishment. She had gone out seeking enough to survive, and she returned with evidence of kindness. Naomi saw what Ruth brought, and something stirred in the older widow. The barley itself spoke before Ruth explained anything. It was too much for an ordinary day of gleaning. This was not merely leftover grain. This was favor. Naomi asked where Ruth had gleaned, where she had worked, and blessed the man who had taken notice of her. Notice how quickly blessing returned to Naomi's mouth when she saw kindness touching Ruth. Grief had made her call herself Mara, but mercy began drawing blessing from her again. Ruth told her the name of the man with whom she had worked, Boaz. At that name the room changed. The past and future seemed to meet in Naomi's heart. Boaz was not a stranger. Boaz was a relative. Boaz was one of their redeemers. Naomi said, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." This is a breathtaking turn. Earlier, Naomi had said the Lord had brought her back empty. Now, in the glow of an unexpected provision, She speaks of the Lord's kindness. She does not yet see the whole miracle, but she sees enough to know that God has not utterly abandoned them. A name, a field, a harvest, a day of favor, and the faithfulness of Ruth become the first threads of healing. Ruth continued gleaning in the fields of Boaz, staying close to his young women through the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. Day after day, the rhythm of provision continued. Morning light over Bethlehem, feet moving through fields, hands gathering grain. Boaz' protection covering Ruth, Naomi waiting at home, no longer in complete despair, perhaps listening each evening for Ruth's return. The seasons moved slowly, and with them, something inside Naomi began to move too. She was still a widow. Her losses were still real. Her sons did not return. Elimelech did not walk through the doorway. Restoration did not erase grief, but grace entered the grief and began to make a dwelling there. Naomi had believed she was useless, but Ruth needed her wisdom. Naomi had believed she had returned empty, but Ruth returned each day with food. Naomi had believed the Lord had turned against her, but now she began to recognize the shape of covenant kindness. And beloved listener, this is how healing often begins in the elderly heart. Not all at once, not with the past undone, but with small evidences of mercy gathered like barley in tired hands. A kind word, a safe place, a younger person who listens, a provision that arrives at evening, a memory that no longer only wounds but begins to teach, a sense, faint but real, that God may still be near. So rest here for a moment in the field of Boaz, beneath the wide Judean sky, where barley moves softly in the wind and the Lord hides redemption inside ordinary labor. See Ruth bending low with humility and see the eyes of God upon her. See Naomi in the quiet house, still wounded, yet not forgotten. See Boaz walking among the workers with blessing on his lips. See the edges of the field left open for the poor, because long before Ruth ever arrived there, God had written mercy into the harvest. Nothing here is rushed. The Lord does not force Naomi's heart to heal before it is ready. He does not demand that Ruth understand the future before she takes the next faithful step. He simply leads them through the next mercy, and the next and the next. And tonight perhaps that is enough for you too. You do not need to see the whole harvest. You do not need to understand every loss. You do not need to know how God will use the years that remain. You may simply rest under His wings. You may gather the small mercy of this breath, this moment, this quiet reminder that you are not abandoned. The God who guided Ruth to the right field is still able to guide weary hearts. The God who awakened Naomi through one name, Boaz, is still able to awaken hope in the places you thought were too bitter to bloom. As the harvest days passed in Bethlehem, Naomi began to sit differently inside the quiet of her home. The grief was still there, like an old wound beneath the skin, tender when touched by memory, heavy when evening came and the shadows lengthened across the floor. Elimelech was still gone. Mahlon and Chilion were still gone. The rooms of her life still held echoes that no amount of barley could silence completely. But something had changed. It was not loud. It was not sudden. It did not arrive like a trumpet in the streets or fire across the sky. It came slowly, like dawn touching one stone at a time. Ruth kept returning from the fields of Boaz with food in her arms and a quiet dignity around her soul. Each day the provision continued. Each day the young widow went out beneath the wide sky, and each evening she came back with evidence that God had made a way through kindness. Naomi watched her. She listened. She weighed the name Boaz in her heart again and again. A relative, a man of standing, one of the family redeemers, a door in the wall of loss. And somewhere deep inside Naomi, The place that had called itself empty began to remember that wisdom had not died with her sons. Experience had not been buried with her husband. Prayer had not become useless because sorrow had aged her. She was not only a woman who had lost, she was also a woman who knew. She knew the laws of Israel. She knew the meaning of a redeemer. She knew the sacred patterns of protection, inheritance, and family restoration, and what she knew could become a lamp for Ruth. There is a holy moment in the life of an older person when pain, memory, and wisdom begin to meet. For years perhaps Naomi had carried her past as a burden. Bethlehem before famine, Moab after exile, the graves, the long road home, the bitter words spoken before the women of the town. But now the same past that had wounded her also held knowledge Ruth needed. Naomi's years had not been wasted. Her suffering had not erased her usefulness. Her age had not made her irrelevant to the unfolding mercy of God. In fact, it was Naomi, not Ruth, who understood the deeper meaning of Boaz. Ruth had seen kindness in a field. Naomi saw covenant possibility. Ruth had received grain. Naomi recognized redemption. Ruth had been protected by a good man. Naomi understood that God may have placed that good man within reach for a purpose far beyond one day's meal. And so Naomi began to speak again, not from bitterness now, but from discernment. She said, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" Such gentle words, such motherly words, such restored words. The woman who once believed she had nothing to offer now began planning the rest and covering of someone younger. She was becoming Naomi again, pleasant, tender, wise, a vessel of grace. Beloved listener, linger here for a moment, because this is where the story begins to touch the modern ache so deeply. Many elderly hearts know what Naomi felt. After loss, after illness, after retirement, after children have grown and left, after the body has slowed, after the house has grown quieter than it used to be, a whisper may come in the dark and say, "What am I good for now?" You may have once been the one everyone called, the one who prepared meals, the one who knew where things belonged, the one who drove, carried, earned, repaired, organized, remembered, comforted, prayed, and held the family together without anyone noticing how much strength it took. Then life changed. A spouse went home to the Lord. Strength became smaller. Independence became fragile. The world began to move quickly, and you began to feel passed by. But Naomi teaches us that God does not measure purpose by youth, speed, or outward productivity. Sometimes your purpose becomes quieter and deeper. Sometimes what remains is not less valuable, but more refined. The years have placed wisdom in you. Grief has given weight to your compassion. Waiting has taught you patience. Loss has taught you what truly matters. And the very things you thought disqualified, you may become the sacred preparation God uses to guide someone else into blessing. Naomi told Ruth to wash, anoint herself, put on her cloak, and go down to the threshing floor where Boaz would be winnowing barley that night. The instruction was delicate, careful, and rooted in the customs of her people. This was not manipulation. It was not desperation dressed as strategy. It was an appeal for redemption within the boundaries of honor. Naomi knew that Boaz would be at the threshing floor after the harvest work, when the grain was separated, when the wind moved across the open place and carried away the chaff. She knew Ruth must not interrupt the meal or the work. She told Ruth to wait until Boaz had finished eating and drinking, until he lay down, and then to note the place where he lay. Ruth was to uncover his feet and lie down, and he would tell her what to do. To our modern ears, the scene may feel strange, but in that ancient world it carried the language of humble petition. Ruth would be asking Boaz to spread his covering over her, to act as redeemer, to bring protection where loss had left exposure. And Naomi, who had once sent Ruth away on the road to Moab's future, now sends Ruth forward into Israel's hope. This is the miracle beginning to move through Naomi's counsel. The old widow is not simply receiving help, she is helping. She is not merely surviving another day. She is participating in God's restoration. Ruth listened to Naomi and answered with full trust. All that you say I will do. There was love in that obedience, and there was honor. Ruth did not treat Naomi as a burden. Ruth did not dismiss the older woman's counsel as outdated or irrelevant. Ruth recognized that Naomi carried understanding she did not have, and in this tender exchange, God shows us a holy pattern that every generation needs. The young need the old, and the old need the young. Ruth had strength to go into the fields, to glean beneath the sun, to step into unknown places with courage. Naomi had memory, wisdom, and spiritual interpretation. Ruth could gather grain. Naomi could recognize the Redeemer. Ruth could walk to the threshing floor. Naomi could explain why the journey mattered. When these two lives came together, loss began turning into legacy. This is why the enemy of your soul wants elderly people to believe they are finished, because an older believer who blesses, guides, prays, forgives, and remembers God's faithfulness can become a doorway for entire generations. Naomi's body may have been slower than Ruth's, but her insight moved the story forward. Her voice became a bridge between emptiness and redemption. And so the night came down over Bethlehem. The fields that had glowed beneath harvest light now softened into shadow. The sky deepened from gold into violet, and then into a dark, quiet blue spread with stars. The day's heat lifted from the earth. The smell of barley, dust, and crushed stalks lingered in the air. At the threshing floor, where the grain was processed after harvest, men worked with practiced rhythm. The sound of winnowing may have moved through the night, grain tossed into the air so the wind could carry the lighter chaff away, while the heavier kernels fell back to the ground. It was a place of separation, useful grain from empty husk, weight from weightlessness, substance from what could not feed. And how fitting that Ruth came there at night, because God was also separating things in the hidden places of Naomi's story. He was separating bitterness from wisdom, despair from hope, emptiness from destiny, loss from the lie that loss was all that remained. The threshing floor became more than a place of harvest. It became a quiet altar of transition, a place where the God who works in shadows began bringing hidden redemption closer to the light. Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was content after the labor of harvest. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, guarding the fruit of the season, resting beneath the open sky. Around him, the night was calm. The grain lay gathered nearby like a sign of provision. The air may have carried the coolness that comes after a long day in the fields. Ruth approached softly, carefully, just as Naomi had instructed. Every step must have carried humility and courage together. She was a foreign widow. He was a man of standing. She had no power to demand. She came not with force, but with trust. She uncovered his feet and lay down. The night held stillness around her. Above them, the stars burned quietly over Judah. Around them, the harvest slept. Inside Ruth, perhaps, the words of Naomi repeat gently. He will tell you what to do. This was not a moment of control. It was a moment of surrender. Ruth had done what faith could do, and now she waited in the silence. And beloved listener, there are times in life when you too come to the edge of what you can do. You have prayed, you have loved, You have endured, you have taken the next step, and then you must wait at the feet of mercy, trusting that God can speak into what you cannot control. At midnight, Boaz was startled and turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. The darkness around them was not empty now. It was charged with holy possibility. He asked, "Who are you?" Ruth answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." The words reached back to the blessing Boaz had spoken over her in the field. He had said she had come under the wings of the Lord, the God of Israel, for refuge. Now Ruth asks Boaz to become the human expression of that refuge, to spread the corner of his garment over her, to act as redeemer, to cover what loss had left uncovered. In the stillness of that night, Ruth's request was both personal and covenantal. She was not only asking for marriage, she was asking for restoration, for Naomi, for the family line, for the name of the dead, for protection, for future, for a place within the people she had chosen. She came with humility, but not without courage. She came vulnerable, but not without faith. And Naomi's wisdom was present in every word Ruth spoke, even though Naomi herself was at home waiting. Boaz answered with honor. He did not take advantage of Ruth's vulnerability. He did not shame her for coming. He did not dismiss her because she was a Moabite. He blessed her. He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter." He recognized her kindness, saying that this last kindness was greater than the first, because she had not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. Ruth had chosen covenant faithfulness over easier paths. She had chosen the way that could restore Naomi's family, not merely secure her own comfort. Then Boaz told her not to fear. All that she asked he would do, for the people of the town knew she was a worthy woman. What a beautiful reversal. Ruth, who came as a stranger, is now known as worthy. Ruth, who bent low among leftovers, is now honored by a redeemer. Ruth, who left her homeland with no promise of future, is now standing inside the first spoken promise of restoration. Boaz's words were like warmth in the midnight air. Do not fear. How often God begins healing with those words. Do not fear. Your vulnerability is seen. Your courage is seen. Your loyalty is seen. Your future is not abandoned. Yet Boaz was righteous enough to speak the whole truth. There was another redeemer nearer than he. He could not simply move ahead in desire without honoring the law. If the nearer redeemer would redeem, then he must. But if the man would not, Boaz promised as the Lord lived that he would redeem Ruth. So Ruth lay at his feet until morning, resting between promise and uncertainty. That is a tender place to rest, not yet redeemed publicly, not yet secure in the outcome, not yet holding the answer in her hands, but not hopeless either. A promise had been spoken. A redeemer had said, "Do not fear." A future had opened, though it still had to pass through the gate of lawful decision. And Naomi, back in the quiet of her home, waited. Imagine her through the night, perhaps unable to sleep deeply, listening to the silence, wondering what had happened, wondering how Boaz had responded, wondering whether her counsel had led Ruth into blessing or disappointment. Older people know this kind of waiting. The waiting after advice is given. The waiting after a child leaves the house. The waiting after a prayer is prayed, and nothing more can be done. The waiting when love has reached its limit and only God can carry the outcome. Before Ruth left the threshing floor, Boaz gave her 6 measures of barley and placed it upon her. He did not send her back empty. This detail is quiet but full of mercy. Naomi had said, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." Now Ruth returns to Naomi with grain again, a sign heavy enough to carry a silent message from the Redeemer, not empty, not forgotten, not dismissed. The morning was still dim when Ruth went back into the city. The streets of Bethlehem may have been pale and cool, not yet fully awake. The stones held the chill of night. The sky slowly lightened. Ruth carried the barley to Naomi, and Naomi asked, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Ruth told her all that Boaz had done. She showed the grain. She repeated his words, that she must not go back empty to her mother-in-law. Do you hear the healing in that? Boaz understood something. Ruth's blessing and Naomi's restoration were bound together. The barley was not only provision for Ruth, it was a word to Naomi. The emptiness Naomi had named was being answered gently, measure by measure, through the kindness of God working through people. Then Naomi spoke with a steadiness that reveals how far grace had already brought her. She told Ruth to wait, to sit still, for Boaz would not rest until the matter was settled that day. Naomi, who once saw only bitterness, now recognizes righteous action. She understands the character of Boaz. She sees that redemption has begun moving and will not remain unfinished. Her counsel now becomes peace. Sit still, my daughter. Wait, the man will not rest. These are words for Ruth, but they are also words for every weary listener whose heart has labored long. Sit still, beloved. Wait in the mercy of God. Your Redeemer does not sleep in forgetfulness. Your Redeemer does not abandon what he has promised. There are matters beyond your hands, beyond your strength, beyond your ability to arrange. But there is a God who works while you rest. There is a Christ who carries what you cannot carry. There is a Redeemer who does not grow tired of your need. Naomi had learned enough through barley, kindness, and midnight promise to tell Ruth that rest was now the faithful thing. Not striving, not panic, not trying to force the future. Rest. And this is where the divine miracle begins to shine with quiet power. God did not restore Naomi by pretending her losses were small. He did not ask her to deny the graves in Moab. He did not erase her years of sorrow or make her young again or give her back the exact life she once had. Instead, he took what remained and filled it with purpose. He used Ruth's loyalty. He used Naomi's wisdom. He used Boaz's righteousness. He used the law of gleaning, the timing of harvest, the customs of redemption, the courage of a young widow, and the discernment of an older one. Nothing was wasted. The famine was not wasted. The road was not wasted. The grief was not wasted. Even Naomi's return in bitterness became part of the path toward blessing. This does not mean God delights in pain. No, the heart of the Lord is tender toward the broken. But it means pain does not have the authority to cancel his purpose. What felt like the end to Naomi was becoming preparation. What felt like emptiness was making room for a gift she never could have imagined. What felt like being left alive for no reason was becoming the very reason another generation would be blessed. The next morning, Boaz went up to the city gate and sat there. The gate was the place where elders gathered, where business was witnessed, where legal matters were decided, where the life of the community passed through judgment and agreement. Imagine the early light spreading over Bethlehem, touching the stone walls and narrow passages, waking the town slowly. Men came and went. Donkeys moved with loads. Voices rose in the cool air. The smell of bread fires began to drift from homes. Women carried water. Children stirred near doorways. And Boaz sat with purpose. He was not delaying. He was not hiding. He brought the matter of Ruth and Naomi into the public place where redemption could be secured with honor. When the nearer Redeemer passed by, Boaz called him to sit. And then he gathered 10 men of the elders of the city. The scene is calm, but beneath its calm is enormous weight. Naomi's future, Ruth's future, the name of the dead, the land of Elimelech, the restoration of a family line. All of it now stood before witnesses at the gate. Boaz first spoke of the land that belonged to Elimelech, explaining that Naomi, who had returned from Moab, was selling the parcel. He offered the nearer redeemer the opportunity to redeem it in the presence of the elders. At first, the man said he would redeem it. Land had value. Property could increase his estate. The matter may have seemed simple, but Boaz then revealed the fuller responsibility. On the day the man acquired the field from Naomi, he would also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to raise up the name of the dead on his inheritance. Suddenly, redemption was no longer only about gaining land. It involved sacrificial obligation. It involved Ruth. It involved preserving another man's name. It involved a future that might not benefit the Redeemer in the obvious way. The nearer man drew back. He could not redeem it for himself, lest he impair his own inheritance, and so he told Boaz to redeem it. In that moment, what could have been closed opened, what could have been delayed moved forward, what could have remained tangled became clear. God was clearing the path. In the custom of that time, the man removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz as a sign of the transaction. It may seem small to us, but it was a public seal, a visible witness that the rite of redemption had passed. Boaz then spoke before the elders and all the people. He declared that they were witnesses that day, that he had bought from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and to Chilion and Mahlon. He declared that he had acquired Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, to be his wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, so that the name of the dead would not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. Listen gently to what is happening. The names Naomi thought were lost are being spoken again in the public square. Elimelech, Chilion, Mahlon, the dead are not forgotten. The family is not erased. The story is not cut off. Redemption does not deny loss. It honors what was lost and carries the line forward. Naomi's grief is being answered not by forgetting, but by remembrance transformed into future. The people and elders at the gate said they were witnesses, and they blessed Ruth. They asked the Lord to make the woman coming into Boaz's house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. They blessed Boaz to act worthily in Ephratah and be renowned in Bethlehem. They asked that his house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord would give by this young woman. The blessing rose in the city gate like a covering over everything that had been broken. Ruth, once foreign and poor in the field, is now blessed as a mother in Israel. Boaz, already honorable, is blessed in his obedience. Naomi, though not standing at the center of the public words, is included in the restoration they proclaim. The town that once asked, "Is this Naomi?" now witnesses the beginning of Naomi's healing. The woman who returned saying, "Call me bitter," is being gathered into a story of kindness, so large that generations will speak of it. And God, quiet through so much of the book, is present in every thread. This is the miracle, but it is a miracle with soft edges. No sea splits, no fire falls, no angel appears before the city gate. Instead, a harvest leads to a field leads to favor leads to counsel leads to midnight courage leads to public redemption leads to marriage leads to new life, and new life leads to a lineage that reaches beyond Naomi's lifetime. God's miracles are not always sudden interruptions. Sometimes they are holy arrangements, a timing you did not plan, a person you did not expect, a law of mercy written long before you needed it, a conversation at the right moment, a younger person who stays, an older person who remembers, a redeemer who acts with integrity. For Naomi, the divine miracle was not that the past became painless. It was that the future became possible. It was that God took a woman who felt emptied by death and made her part of a living line. It was that an elderly widow who thought her story had closed was still needed in the hidden architecture of redemption. Beloved listener, let this truth settle slowly over your heart. Perhaps your life has not unfolded as you imagined. Perhaps age has brought more loss than you expected. Perhaps you have buried dreams, roles, relationships, abilities, or seasons that once made you feel alive. Perhaps you have wondered whether you are still here only because time has not yet finished with you. But what if, in the hands of God, your remaining life is not leftover life? What if it is prepared life? What if the compassion you carry now was shaped through tears, so you could comfort someone with a gentleness they desperately need? What if the prayers you pray from your chair, your bed, your quiet room, or your kitchen table are stronger than you know? What if your stories, your warnings, your blessings, your forgiveness, your memory of God's faithfulness are seeds for a harvest you may only partly see? Naomi could not run into the fields like Ruth. She could not stand at the gate like Boaz. But she could guide, she could bless, she could interpret, she could wait, she could receive. And through those quiet acts, she became part of the miracle. God reframes the pain slowly. The loneliness that made Naomi ache became the space where Ruth's loyalty shone. The age that made Naomi feel finished became the vessel of wisdom Ruth needed. The loss that made her call herself bitter became the very background against which redemption appeared bright and tender. The return to Bethlehem that felt humiliating became the doorway into harvest. The empty arms that had no sons left to hold would one day hold a child whose life would carry the family forward. This is not a shallow promise that every sorrow will look the same as Naomi's. It is a deeper assurance that God knows how to work through what remains. He knows how to make meaning after loss. He knows how to bring companionship after isolation. He knows how to use memories that once only hurt as testimonies that later heal. He knows how to place the future into hands that thought they had nothing left to carry. And he knows how to let an elderly person become a sign of hope, not because the years were easy, but because grace was faithful through them. So see Naomi now, perhaps sitting in her home while Bethlehem continues around her. She may not yet know everything that will come, but the air is different. Ruth is no longer only a daughter-in-law gleaning for survival. Ruth is promised to Boaz. Redemption has been spoken at the gate. The town has witnessed it. The name of the dead will not be cut off. Naomi's story, once narrowed to graves, has widened into covenant. The sunlight falls across the threshold. The sound of harvest continues in the distance. Grain rests in the house. Ruth's footsteps carry a new steadiness. The bitterness is not the only voice now. There is another voice, quieter and stronger, saying, "The Lord has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi may breathe that truth slowly, not as a woman who has never suffered, but as one who has suffered and is beginning to see mercy move through the ruins. And perhaps tonight you can breathe with her. Slowly, gently. Let the old sentence, "I am empty," begin to loosen. Let another sentence come near. God may still be preparing a harvest through me. The marriage of Boaz and Ruth came as a covering over much pain. It was not merely romance, though tenderness was there. It was not merely security, though protection was there. It was redemption, the holy joining of mercy and responsibility. Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. The young widow who had left Moab with no promise of belonging, entered the house of an honorable man in Bethlehem. Naomi, who had once tried to send Ruth back, now watched Ruth receive rest among the people of God. The Lord, who had seemed hidden through famine, exile, death, and return, gave conception to Ruth, and she bore a son. That sentence is filled with divine tenderness. The child did not come only as a baby to Ruth and Boaz, but as a restoration touching Naomi's deepest wound. For Naomi's sorrow had been bound to the death of sons, the fear that the family name had ended, the unbearable silence of a house without future. Now a cry of life entered that silence. A newborn's breath, small and holy, became a living answer to years of grief. Imagine the first moments after the child was born. The house would have been filled with the soft urgency and wonder that surrounds new life. Women moving gently, voices hushed, warm cloth, water, the trembling cry of a baby entering the world. Ruth, exhausted and radiant in the fragile way of mothers, holding the son she had been given. Boaz, perhaps standing nearby with gratitude too deep for many words. And Naomi, the older widow, hearing the sound. That cry must have entered places in her heart that had long been closed. It did not erase the voices of Mahlon and Chilion, but it answered the silence they had left. It did not replace Elimelech, but it brought honor to the family line that seemed broken. The child's cry was not denial of grief. It was life speaking into grief. It was God saying, I have been working where you could not see. I have been weaving where you thought everything was torn. I have been carrying the future through the faithfulness of Ruth, the righteousness of Boaz, and the wisdom that still lived in you, Naomi. Then the women of Bethlehem spoke to Naomi. Their words are among the most healing in the story. Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. A restorer of life, a nourisher of your old age. Let those words move slowly through the heart. God did not forget Naomi's old age. He did not look upon her later years as useless or empty. He provided nourishment for that season too, not only bread for the body, but meaning for the soul. Not only survival, but restoration. The women recognized what Naomi herself could not have imagined when she returned bitter to Bethlehem. They saw that Ruth, who loved Naomi and was more to her than 7 sons, had given birth to a child who would bring life back into Naomi's story. More than 7 sons. What a powerful statement. In a world where sons represented security, inheritance, and continuation, the women declared that Ruth's love had been abundantly precious. God had brought Naomi a daughter whose covenant faithfulness became a channel of healing. And then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. This image is the soft center of the miracle. An elderly widow holding a baby, wrinkled hands supporting tender new life, a heart that had carried graves now carrying a future. The arms that once felt empty are filled. The woman who said the Lord had brought her back empty now has a child resting against her body. The town that heard her bitterness now sees her comfort. The lap that may have seemed only a place of loneliness becomes a cradle of promise. Naomi does not become young again. She does not go back to the beginning. God does not undo time. Instead, he meets her in old age and places meaning there. He lets her become part of the child's nurture. He lets her hold what she could not produce by her own strength. He lets her receive grace through the lives of those she once thought she could only burden. This is such a gentle word for elderly listeners. The miracle may not be that you return to who you were. The miracle may be that God fills who you are now. The neighbors gave the child a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They called his name Obed. A son has been born to Naomi, not because Naomi physically bore him, but because his life restored her family, nourished her age, and placed her within the future again. The child belonged to Ruth and Boaz. Yes, but his meaning overflowed into Naomi's story, and Obed would become the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. The child on Naomi's lap would become the grandfather of Israel's great king, and through the line of David, many generations later, would come Jesus Christ, the true Redeemer, the Son of God, the one who spreads his mercy over all who come to him for refuge. Naomi did not live to see the full line unfold. She did not see David's throne. She did not see Bethlehem shining beneath the birth of Christ. She did not hear angels announce good news of great joy, but she held one small piece of the promise. She held Obed, and that was enough for her part. God allowed her to cradle the beginning of a future far larger than she could understand. This is the divine miracle in its deepest form. Naomi's life, which seemed reduced to famine, exile, death, and bitterness, was gathered into the story of Christ. Her suffering did not remove her from God's plan. Her age did not disqualify her. Her grief did not make her unusable. Her honest lament did not offend God into abandoning her. She became, by grace, part of the lineage through which the Savior would come into the world, not because she was strong, not because she understood everything, not because she never questioned, but because the Lord is merciful, and He knows how to redeem broken stories. And tonight, as this truth settles quietly over the listener's heart, let it bring deep healing to every place that feels too old for purpose, too wounded for joy, too emptied for blessing. You may not see the full meaning of your prayers. You may not know how your endurance is shaping someone younger. You may not understand how God is using the love you gave, the counsel you offered, the forgiveness you chose, the faith you kept through tears. But Naomi did not see the whole story either. She held the child. God held the generations. So if you are still alive, beloved, perhaps it is not an accident. Perhaps your breath remains because God still delights to receive your prayers. Perhaps your days remain because someone needs the blessing only you can speak. Perhaps your memories remain because they contain testimony. Perhaps your weakness remains because through it the tenderness of Christ can be seen more clearly. Perhaps your loneliness has made you more able to notice the lonely. Perhaps your grief has made you safer for those who grieve. Perhaps your age has made your words slower, fewer, and more precious. Naomi's life teaches us that God can use the elderly not only in visible strength, but in hidden influence. A conversation, a blessing, a piece of wisdom, a night of waiting, a willingness to receive joy after sorrow, a child held close, a family line encouraged, a young life guided toward redemption. These are not small things in heaven. These are holy things. And as the body grows tired and the night grows gentle, let the soul rest in this comfort. The Lord has not forgotten the living or the dead. He has not forgotten you. He can still make your life a restorer of life to someone else. Rest now in the image of Naomi with Obed in her arms. The room is warm. The day has softened. Outside, Bethlehem breathes beneath the mercy of God. The fields that once symbolized famine now speak of harvest. The road that once carried grief has led to a cradle. Ruth is near, Boaz is near. The women of the town speak blessing instead of shock. And Naomi, who once returned saying, "Call me bitter," now holds a child whose name means servant. A life that will serve the purposes of God far beyond what any of them can see. Let your heart look at her and understand. Your story is not defined only by what you lost. Your story is also held by the Redeemer, who knows what can still be born through grace. You are allowed to grieve. You are allowed to remember. You are allowed to be tired. But you are also allowed to receive, to be comforted, to be nourished in old age, to let God place some new meaning, however small or quiet, into your hands. Naomi did not force the miracle. She simply kept walking, kept speaking, kept guiding, kept waiting, and finally kept holding what God gave. And now, in the hush after the miracle, let the message become personal and gentle. The years behind you are not wasted. The tears behind you are not ignored. The people you loved are not forgotten by God. The prayers you prayed when no one heard are not lost. The kindness you gave when you were tired still matters. The counsel you offered, even if it seemed small, may be guiding someone in ways you cannot measure. The forgiveness you struggled toward may be breaking chains you cannot see. The faith you held with trembling hands may become an inheritance in another heart. Naomi thought she came back empty, but God knew Ruth was beside her. Naomi thought the story was over, but God knew Boaz was in the field. Naomi thought old age would only be bitter, but God knew Obed would be placed in her arms. And you too may be standing in a chapter you do not fully understand, but Christ understands. The true Redeemer has taken your life into His mercy. He knows every famine, every Moab, every grave, every road, every field, every night of waiting, and every promise still hidden from view. So breathe slowly now. Let the story of Naomi become a soft covering over your thoughts. Let it tell you that God's preparation often feels like emptiness before it feels like harvest. Let it tell you that being reduced is not the same as being rejected. Let it tell you that returning wounded is still returning. Let it tell you that a field can be waiting, a Redeemer can be moving, a blessing can be forming, even when the heart is too tired to imagine it. And let it tell you that old age is not merely the end of strength. In the hands of God, old age can become a sanctuary of wisdom, a cradle of legacy, a quiet altar of prayer, a place where the future is blessed by someone who has suffered and still believes. Naomi's miracle came gently. May your comfort come gently too. May the Lord nourish your old age. May He restore life to the places that feel cold. May He place peace where memories ache. May He remind you that you are still here beneath His care. And may your remaining days, however many He gives, rest under the wings of the Redeemer who never leaves His beloved empty.